I'm done with you two. Just die here. My husband left those words hanging in the air as he abandoned me and our 4-year-old daughter in a snowy mountain. Within the dense wilderness, I had no idea where we were. The icy winds bit into our bodies, making us shiver uncontrollably. "We just have to follow Grandma," my daughter suddenly exclaimed. I looked in the direction she pointed, but there was no one there. Still, I decided to follow her lead, because my beloved daughter has some strange power. My name is Nancy, a 32-year-old remote worker. I met my husband Mark, of the same age, at a group blind date. Mark was a charismatic entrepreneur since college and a smooth talker. I fell in love with him and decided to get married. Mark's family was well respected in our local area, so our friends admired and envied our relationship. Shortly after our wedding, at the request of my in-laws, we moved in with them. They were kind people, but my mother-in-law required constant care due to her frail health. "Nancy, I heard you are a nurse. My wife is so frail, and I've been so worried. We are grateful that you came into our lives. If I can be of any help, I am more than happy to do so," I replied. I quit my job as a nurse to take care for my mother-in-law and started working from home, as I always wanted. I've always enjoyed web designing and creating websites, so I turned my hobby into my profession. It was a job I could do at my own pace, without any strict deadlines. However, one thing that bothered me was that even after 3 years of marriage, we hadn't been blessed with a child. Mark's business was thriving and expanding, opening branches here and there. But he got carried away with his success, frequently going out and rarely coming home. "Listen, Mark, your mom isn't doing well. You should spend some time with her. I'm sure she wants to see you, even if she doesn't say so." "Huh? You are there for her, aren't you? I'm busy." No matter how much I pleaded for his mother, Mark didn't listen. I wanted to show our child to my bedridden mother-in-law who didn't have much time left, and I felt guilty that I couldn't do that. "I'm sorry we couldn't give you a grandchild yet." "Don't say that. I'm satisfied to have a daughter like you, Nancy." My kind mother-in-law was like my real mother, since I lost my parents at an early age. On days when the weather was good, I would take her for walks in her wheelchair, or make nutritious soft-boiled food that she could have with ease. I did my best to make her life comfortable. One day, she called me to her bedside. "I'm glad. You're going to have a lovely daughter soon. She'll be born around the time jasmine will bloom, so name her Jasmine." I would be delighted if that's true." I was puzzled by my mother-in-law's strange words, thinking that maybe her sickness was causing her to hallucinate. Not long after, she passed away, leaving me utterly devastated. I had been by her side every day for the 3 years since we got married. Not long after the funeral, I discovered I was pregnant. The due date was in July, the season for jasmine. Just as my mother-in-law said, it happened, and I was stunned, but more so, I was overwhelmed with joy. I couldn't wait for Mark to come home, so I could share the news. "Mark, listen! I'm pregnant!" "Wait, really? I'm not good with kids. I don't think I want any right now." "Hey, are you being serious?" "If you want to have one so bad, go ahead. But I'm not taking care of it. You'll have to raise it on your own. You're deciding to have it, so you better figure out the finances yourself." I was left speechless by his harsh words. I could smell alcohol on him every day when he came home from work. His clothes reeked of sweet perfume. I had a good idea where my husband Mark was spending his time. For him, I was merely a convenient housemaid who took care of his parents. But I couldn't give up on the precious life growing inside me. I managed to get the necessary things using the money I saved from when I was single and the earnings I had from working. And just as my mother-in-law predicted, our daughter was born during Jasmine's blooming season. We named her Jasmine. She was a beautiful child with glowing skin, who resembled my mother-in-law in some ways. Jasmine grew healthily, but she was a unique child. She would laugh and wave her hands when no one was around since she was a baby. When she started speaking broken words around the age of 2, she began talking towards the family shrine. "Grandma, do you like Jasmine? Jasmine loves Grandma too." Even when I asked Jasmine who she was talking to, she just smiled. When she was 3, I often saw her deep in conversation with someone in the corner of our loft. "Hey, Jasmine, who are you talking to, and about what?" "Well, Grandma said she will give me her bracelet in the drawer." "Grandma did?" "She said she knitted them using the fabric of her favorite sundress." Intrigued, I opened my mother-in-law's drawer. And there, I found a hand-knitted bracelet. Watching Jasmine happily wearing the bracelet, my father-in-law murmured nostalgically, "Ah, those were made from the sundress my wife loved to wear when she was young, so she made them into bracelets. She was skilled at knitting." Surprisingly, it seems that Jasmine can truly communicate with my deceased mother-in-law. But fearing it might bring some harm to her, I decided not to disclose this to anyone. Our days were peaceful, but the good times didn't last forever. Mark was out splurging and abandoned his work. His company was now on the verge of collapsing. We could barely afford our living expenses, relying on the money my father-in-law provided and my earnings. Eventually, Mark had to ask his father for financial help. Thanks to that, his company was somehow able to recover. But would Mark, who continued to lead a carefree lifestyle, change? I was feeling skeptical. One day, Jasmine started saying something concerning. "Daddy is planning to do something bad." "What do you mean?" "I don't know, but Grandma seems worried. She told me to be careful." I didn't quite understand what she meant, but her words lingered in my mind. What kind of trouble could Mark get into? Is it something related to his company? A woman? Money? I thought about it, but without any evidence, I couldn't confront him. But just to be safe, I started carrying a voice recorder. And I told my daughter not to tell her father that she could see her grandmother. It was because I had a vague feeling of unease. Then I found numerous receipts from strip clubs and bars while going through Mark's stuff. Despite the company's financial struggle and even after asking his father for help, his habit of going out hadn't changed. I also found a note saying, "Consult the gang about the plan." What was the gang referring to? If what my daughter says is true, my mother-in-law has been warning us. It might be indicating that danger is approaching for me and Jasmine. I got shivers running down my spine. For several weeks afterward, I was on guard, but in the end, nothing more happened. Gradually, my sense of caution was pushed to the back of my mind, and I resumed my daily life. One day, my husband, unusually in high spirits, spoke to me. "Thanks to Dad's assistance, my business is doing better, and we're making greater profits. So, how about we go on a family vacation after a long time?" Long time? More like for the first time. "Oh, is it?" Jasmine was so young. I booked a hot spring near an amusement park in the mountains. Jasmine will surely be thrilled. Is that so? My heart was wavering. Though there are still some doubts about my husband, I couldn't completely ignore the desire to believe him, who was showing his gentle face, like old times. If my husband has genuinely changed his mind, this could be an opportunity to mend our relationship. With this thought, I agreed to the family trip. And as I prepared for the trip, I gradually forgot about what my daughter had said and was excited about the long-awaited trip. On the day of the trip, I was surprised to see the rental car my husband had borrowed. It was equipped with snow-tread tires, which made me slightly afraid, thinking we were heading into a snowy mountain. But I couldn't refuse at the last minute, fearing it would spoil the trip and my husband's mood. I quietly sat in the back seat of the car driven by my husband with my daughter. But in hindsight, I should have been more cautious. More than an hour after our departure, it felt like my husband was driving deep into the mountains, saying we were heading to the hot spring. Moreover, there was quite a lot of snow. Soon, we passed by the interstate and started driving on a side road, and I thought something was wrong. "Hey dear, isn't this road strange? Do you think there would be a hotel on a mountain trail that's this off the interstate? Are you sure we're on the right route?" But my husband didn't answer anything and continued driving, his frightening face frowning, looking straight ahead. Feeling anxious, I held my daughter tightly and bit my lip. And then, on the path where there was no road, my husband abruptly stopped the road. "You two are of no use to me anymore. Sleep quietly here." Saying that, my husband dragged me and my 4-year-old daughter out of the car. "Oh, I almost forgot. I'll be taking your phone with me." "Wait, dear!" No matter how much I screamed, my husband ignored me. And the moment he started the car, he turned to us, smirked, and drove away. No way. We were left behind. Snow was falling all around, and we didn't even know where we were in the thick forest. My husband had taken my phone, but I had secretly put a spare one in my backpack. Unfortunately, there was no signal, and I couldn't call for help. Still, from the moment the car left the interstate, I had a bad feeling, and both Jasmine and I were wearing our winter coats and had our backpacks on. Moreover, since it was winter, I had many things packed in my bag, for in case anything happened. Although I thought it would be fine, my daughter Jasmine's words had been lingering in my mind. I had prepared various things just in case, but I never expected this to happen. The wind that blew was as cold as ice, making me shiver down to my core. I took out a disposable hand warmer from my backpack, warmed my body, and calmed Jasmine down by giving her a caramel candy to chew on. Even as I did this, the snow only got worse, and it seemed like we were going to end up stranded, all alone. What should we do? As I was at a loss, Jasmine suddenly shouted out, "Mom! Grandma is saying she's coming over here!" I looked in the direction Jasmine was pointing, but there was nobody there. No, I couldn't see anyone, but it seemed like Jasmine could. "We should do as Grandma says." Jasmine confidently started to walk, and I decided to follow her. After all, she has a mysterious power. That's why I believed we'd somehow make it. I think that's what I wanted to believe. I walked carefully through the accumulating snow, holding Jasmine's hand tightly so as not to slip. "Mom, I see a light! Grandma is telling us to go towards it." Indeed, I could see a light in the direction Jasmine was pointing. We're saved, I thought, feeling like I was about to burst into tears. "Thank you, mother-in-law." I quietly whispered my gratitude to my mother-in-law. Finally reaching a hotel at the foot of the mountains, we decided to rest there to warm up. I had put extra cash in my backpack, so I knew we could stay for a while. And now I began to plan my revenge on my husband. Don't think I'll forgive you for this. I'm going to thoroughly investigate why you wanted us dead, so be prepared. 5 days later, I contacted my father-in-law. My father-in-law was very surprised to hear from me, but when he found out that Jasmine and I were safe, he was very happy and came to pick us up from the hotel. According to my father-in-law, my husband had been telling people that my daughter and I fell into a valley in the snowy mountains and died. I was flabbergasted. On top of that, he apparently said, "We searched, but couldn't find them. It doesn't look like we'll be able to find them until spring. And it's sad to leave it at that, but we're going to hold the funeral first." Despite my father-in-law telling him to wait a little longer, he was going ahead with the preparations. Furthermore, my father-in-law handed me something. With that, I found out a shocking truth. Upon visiting my husband, sure enough, preparations were underway for our funeral. Large photographs of Jasmine and I were being displayed as portraits. Then, Jasmine and I suddenly appeared on the scene. "What? How come?" The relatives helping with the preparations were shocked, almost dropping to their knees. Stunned and staring wide-eyed at us, my husband blurted out a silly voice. "Huh? You're alive?" "Unfortunately for you, we're alive and well." How?" "You thought we would die as you planned, didn't you? After you left Jasmine and I deep in the snowy mountains." "What are you talking about?" People around us began to stir. No surprise there. If my husband intentionally left us, even though he told everyone we had fallen into a valley in the snowy mountains, this would be a serious crime. "Stop lying!" "Can you say the same after hearing this?" I played an audio from the hidden voice recorder I had. "I don't need you guys anymore. Just die here." Mark's voice echoed, and the people present started to stir even more. "I never said that! She's making up lies!" He tried his best to shut me up, but his face was pale and his mouth was trembling. To finish him off, I played a video from my phone. In the video, Mark said, "As planned, I abandoned them in the snow-capped mountains. With the life insurance money from my wife and daughter, my company can recover, and I can also enjoy a luxurious lifestyle. Of course, I'll also repay the loan I took from your group with some extra, so please, wait a little." The video perfectly captured him on the phone with someone in the car. He tried to shut off the camera in a hurry, but it was too late. Everyone was whispering, giving Mark cold, scornful looks. "How did this get out? Who was it?" "I asked your father to copy the footage from the dash cam in the rental car you used." "Dad, you abandoned your own son? Why would you side with a complete stranger?" Mark said as he confronted my father-in-law. However, it seemed that my father-in-law was very angry, glaring at Mark with a terrifying expression. "Well, it's no surprise that he would abandon you. After all, you secretly took out a large life insurance policy on not only Jasmine and me, but also on your father." I wonder, when you mentioned group, did you borrow money from a sketchy organization and then targeted our lives? Unbelievable. My father-in-law stood imposingly, thrusting a life insurance policy he found in Mark's drawer at him and shouting, "You were planning to kill me too, weren't you? You wanted all my assets to yourself, didn't you? How dare you call yourself my son?" And so, with accusations from his father and evidence piling up, Mark, now cornered with no way out, made a startling statement. "Look, everyone ended up alive. So it's all good, right? I was forced into doing this by loan sharks. I had it tough too. So forgive me. Don't make me laugh. There's no way I can forgive you. I'll be reporting this to the police. No way! We're a family! You can let this slide, right? Please? And so, Mark got on his knees and bowed in front of us. My father-in-law and I looked at each other in disbelief. I'm sorry. I'll change my ways. Please forgive me. Spare me from the police. I'll turn my life around. With his forehead rubbing against the floor, shedding tears, snot, and drool, Mark made a truly pitiful sight. There's absolutely no way. I'm utterly disgusted with you. You can go to hell. Mark probably expected his apology to solve the situation, though hearing this, he was shocked. One of the relatives who had been listening to our exchange had apparently reported it to the police, and the police arrived to take Mark away. In the end, with all the evidence against him, Mark was convicted of a serious crime for attempting to take the lives of his wife, daughter, and his own father. He will likely be behind bars for a very long time. My husband's company went bankrupt, and it's clear that his life will be miserable even if he gets out from jail, as his family, including my father-in-law, have all turned their backs on him. Furthermore, his friends who led my husband astray have also been arrested. We obviously got divorced, and I won full custody of our daughter, Jasmine. In addition, at the earnest request of my father-in-law, Jasmine and I formed a special adoption bond with him and received his inheritance as a gift while he's still alive. Now we live with my kind father-in-law. He and I enjoy watching over Jasmine's growth. My father-in-law often tells me, "Find a good man and get remarried. I will give you my blessings." But for now, I have no intention of getting married. I am more than happy with my life right now. The other day, Jasmine whispered in my ear, "Grandma says she's glad, but we can't meet her anymore, so she's saying goodbye." It made me a bit sad, but if it means that there's nothing my mother-in-law needs to protect us from anymore, then I guess it's a good thing. Dear mother-in-law, I will protect Jasmine with everything I have. I made a promise to her today as I placed my hands together in front of her grave.
I'm Jess, a 26-year-old nurse who's seen enough to know life ain't always a smooth ride. The day that rock band rolled into town was a break from the usual chaos. Their music was my escape, something my soul craved more than my next breath. That night, I decided to let loose, heading to their concert alone, not knowing it'd change my life. The arena was packed, the air electric with anticipation. I wove through the crowd, finding a spot that felt like it was made just for me. That's when I bumped into him, literally. A tall guy with a mischievous smile, wearing a band tee that looked like it had seen better days. "Hey, watch it!" I snapped, more out of surprise than annoyance. "Sorry, didn't see you there," he replied, his grin widening. "You here alone?" "Yeah, and by the looks of it, so are you." I shot back, my defenses up. He laughed, a sound that seemed to cut through the pre-concert buzz. "Name's Tom. And yeah, I wouldn't miss this for the world. These guys are like the soundtrack to my life." "Jess," I said, offering a hand grudgingly. His grip was firm, reassuring somehow. "Same here. Grew up with their music." We chatted as if we'd known each other for years, not minutes. Tom had a way of making me laugh, really laugh, something I hadn't done in a while. When the concert started, we were lost in the music, together yet alone in our little bubble. After the encore, neither of us wanted the night to end. "Know a decent cafe around here?" Tom asked, his eyes searching mine. "Might do. Follow me," I said, leading the way. The cafe was quiet, a stark contrast to the concert's frenzy. We found a secluded corner, our conversation flowing as easily as the coffee. "So, nurse, huh? Bet you've got stories," Tom said, his voice a mix of curiosity and respect. "More than I can count. And what about you? What's your deal?" I asked, leaning in. "I work in IT. Not as exciting as saving lives, but it pays the bills." He shrugged, a hint of humility in his eyes. We talked about everything and nothing, from our craziest dreams to our mundane daily gripes. It felt natural, easy. Before we knew it, hours had passed. "Should probably get going," Tom said reluctantly. "But I don't want this to be the last time we talk." "Me neither," I admitted, feeling a connection I couldn't quite explain. We exchanged phones, typing in our numbers with the promise of a call. As we said goodbye, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the music, the night, or just Tom himself, but I walked away feeling lighter, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few months of dating Tom, the day came to meet his family, or more accurately, his mom. He'd been upfront about living with her, saying she was all he had in terms of family. I respected that. My own family was just my grandma, after all. Tom's place was modest, a cozy little house with a garden that looked like it needed a bit of love. "Mom's inside," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice as we approached the door. It struck me then how important this was to him, and suddenly, I was the one feeling jittery. The door swung open to reveal a woman in her late 50s, her hair a tangle of curls, eyes sharp as they landed on me. "So, you're Jess," she said, her voice carrying a note that I couldn't quite place. Was it curiosity? Suspicion? "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Johnson," I offered, extending a hand that she took after a brief hesitation. "Call me Linda," she said, leading us into the living room. The place was neat, filled with photos of Tom at various ages. It was clear he was the center of her world. We sat, and Linda wasted no time diving in. "Tom tells me you're a nurse. That's a hard job. You plan on doing that long?" I nodded, sensing where this was heading. "I love my job, but I'm also planning to study further, maybe become a doctor someday." Linda's eyes narrowed a bit. "A doctor, huh? That's a lot of school. Expensive, too." Tom jumped in, trying to smooth the waters. "Mom, Jess is really passionate about her work. It's one of the things I admire about her." Linda turned her gaze to Tom, and then back to me, her expression softening slightly. "Tommy here has always been my rock. After his dad left, it was just the two of us. I've given everything to him, you know." I caught Tom's eye, a silent communication passing between us. I knew this was hard for him, torn between the two most important women in his life. Linda continued, "I rely on Tom for a lot. He's been so good to me, giving me half his salary every month. It's only fair, after all I've sacrificed." The air in the room felt heavier, the tension palpable. I didn't know what to say. It was clear Linda expected this arrangement to continue, even with me in the picture. "And what about your family, Jess?" Linda's question snapped me back to the moment. "I was raised by my grandmother," I said, my voice steady. "My parents died when I was young. Grandma's all I have." Linda nodded, a strange satisfaction in her eyes. "Well, if you and Tom are serious, I'd expect you to contribute as well. $800 a month should cover it." I choked on the tea I'd been sipping. $800? Tom's hand found mine under the table, squeezing it gently. "We'll work something out, Mom. Jess and I are a team now." When Tom and I decided to tie the knot, we knew it wouldn't be a lavish affair, but nothing prepared me for the battle over our wedding plans. Linda had her own ideas about saving money, which basically meant cutting down our guest list to a handful and scrapping any unnecessary celebrations. I wanted simple, sure, but I also wanted some joy, some celebration of us. One evening, as we sat down with Linda to discuss the wedding plans, the tension was thicker than the coffee Tom had brewed. "So, I was thinking, Linda began, in that way that told you she wasn't just thinking, she was deciding. Why waste money on a big venue when we have a perfectly good backyard? Tom squeezed my hand under the table, a silent plea for patience. Mom, Jess, and I were hoping for a bit more, celebration. Not just a backyard thing. Linda's eyes narrowed, her lips pursing in that familiar line of disapproval. And who's going to pay for this celebration? You too? With what money? I took a deep breath, readying myself. We've been saving, Linda. And it's not like we want something extravagant. Just something a bit more special than the backyard. Linda scoffed. Special? You think spending money you don't have on one day is special? You know what's special? Security. Not starting your married life in debt. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I held my ground. We understand the value of money, Linda. We're not talking about going into debt. Just a modest celebration at a small venue. We've done the math. Despite Linda's protests, we managed to reach a compromise of sorts, a small venue, close family and friends, and a strict budget. Linda insisted on overseeing the catering, claiming she could cut costs, which meant we ended up with a buffet that was more potluck than professional. On the day of our wedding, the venue looked, well, modest. My grandma, the one person from my family there, whispered to me as I readied myself, "This Linda, she's a piece of work, isn't she? Just remember, dear, you're marrying Tom, not his mother." The ceremony was short and sweet. Tom looked handsome, and when I walked down the aisle towards him, the look in his eyes told me we'd made the right choice. It was our moment, and even Linda couldn't tarnish that. At the reception, as guests mingled and the homemade buffet was served, Linda took it upon herself to remind everyone how much money we'd saved. "Just think what they can now put towards their future," she announced to a group of our friends, who nodded politely, their expressions a mix of amusement and sympathy. Tom's best man, Mike, a childhood friend who knew the family dynamics all too well, leaned over to us with a grin. "Hey, at least she didn't charge entry, right?" I laughed, the tension of the past weeks melting away in the warmth of the moment. Tom wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me close. "We did it, Jess. Despite everything, we did it." "Yeah," I agreed, leaning my head against his shoulder. "And now, we start our lives together, just us." "And Linda," Tom added with a wry smile, earning him a playful jab in the ribs from me. Settling into married life with Tom was like navigating a boat on choppy waters. Our tiny rented apartment became our haven, a place where we planned to build our future together. But the shadow of financial strain loomed large over us, darkening even our brightest moments. One chilly evening, as we sat huddled over our budget spreadsheet, the reality of our situation hit me hard. "Look at this, Tom," I said, pointing at the screen. "After rent, bills, and your mom's $800, there's barely anything left for us." Tom rubbed his eyes, weary from the long day. "I know, Jess. But what can we do? Mom depends on that money." I sighed, frustration bubbling inside me. But does she really need that much? We're barely scraping by as it is. And we've been putting off so many things, like fixing the car, and even thinking about a down payment for a house. Tom's expression hardened, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Jess, we've been over this. My mom raised me by herself. It's my duty to take care of her now." The argument ended with us in a tense silence, each stewing in our own stubbornness. But it didn't end there. Linda, ever the persistent one, took to calling me regularly, each conversation a thinly veiled reminder not to forget the $800 monthly tribute to her bank account. And when calls didn't cut it, she'd appear at our doorstep, lamenting her hard life and hinting heavily that a little more financial support wouldn't go amiss. I did my best to ignore the hints, to smile and nod and change the subject. But it grated on me, the constant pressure, the relentless reminders of a debt Tom felt we owed. Finally, one evening, after another of Linda's visits, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Tom, we need to talk about your mom," I started, the day's frustrations bubbling to the surface. I'm tired, Tom. Tired of the hints, the constant pressure for more money. We're saving for a down payment, for our future. Can't she see that? Tom's face went from puzzled to dark in seconds. My mom is always right, Jess, he said, his voice icy. You have no right to talk about her like that. She sacrificed everything for me. His words hit like a slap. So what, our plans, our future, doesn't count for anything? I shot back, anger rising. That was it. Tom shut down, walls up, and suddenly we were two strangers living in the same space. He wouldn't talk to me, not really. Our conversations dwindled to nothing, replaced by messages left on stickers on the fridge. Need milk. Working late. The bare minimum of communication. One rare evening, when the silence felt a bit less oppressive, I decided to broach the subject, the words tumbling out of me before I could think better of it. Tom, do you ever think about, us having kids? Tom, who'd been half focused on some bills, looked up, his expression unreadable. Kids? Jess, you know how Mom feels about that. She's already stretched thin with just us helping out. Yeah, but it's not about her, is it? It's about us, what we want, I said, a hint of desperation creeping into my voice. Tom sighed, setting the bills aside. I know, but think about it. The money, the time. How are we supposed to manage all that? Plus, Mom, she's outright against it. Says it's too much expense, too much hassle. I felt a flash of anger, frustration. So, what? Her word is law now? What about what we want, Tom? What about our life together? The room went quiet again, the air thick with words we couldn't seem to say. Tom finally broke the silence. I just don't think now's the right time, Jess. Maybe later, when things are better. The next day, Linda's unannounced visit threw gasoline on the already smoldering embers. I heard you two talking about kids, she started, her tone accusatory as if the mere thought was an affront to her. Yeah, so? I said, my patience worn thin. Linda's eyes narrowed. So, you think you can just bring kids into this mess? You can barely take care of yourselves. Where do you think the money for that will come from? Out of what you should be giving me. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because of the blatant disregard for our autonomy, our desires as a couple. It's our life, Linda. Our decision. I shot back, my voice firm. Your decision? No, my son's decision. And he knows better than to make a foolish mistake like that, Linda countered, her voice rising. The argument spiraled from there, voices raising, words that couldn't be taken back flying between us. It ended with me saying something I'd never thought I'd have to. Maybe we shouldn't see each other for a while. This is too much. Linda left in a huff, and Tom, when he found out, sided with her. Our home felt more like a battleground, each of us entrenched in our positions, the idea of starting a family now a no man's land between us. It started with a phone notification that blinked innocently enough, but held a punch that knocked the wind out of me. Tom had transferred $1,000 to his mom this month, not the usual $800. My mind raced, confusion and anger swirling together. When I confronted him, his response was as cold as the look in his eyes. It's my decision, Jess. It's for my mom, he said, his voice flat, leaving no room for discussion. But we agreed on a budget, Tom. We have our own needs, our own plans. How could you just change that without even talking to me? I shot back, my voice rising with every word. Tom shrugged, a dismissive gesture that stung more than I expected. Things change. I don't have to consult you on everything. That was the moment I felt it, the crack in what I thought was solid, the betrayal of our partnership. But the worst was yet to come. Days later, a friend from work, Carrie, called me, her voice hesitant. Jess, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but I think you should know. She trailed off, the pause heavy with dread. What is it, Carrie? I urged, a sinking feeling in my stomach. I saw Tom's profile on a dating site. He even messaged me, not realizing who I was at first. I'm so sorry, she finished, her voice a mix of sympathy and discomfort. My world stopped. The air left my lungs in a rush, and I felt dizzy. Are you sure? I managed to whisper, clinging to a thread of hope that it was all a mistake. Yes, I'm sure. I can send you the screenshots if you want, Carrie offered, and true to her word, she did. The evidence was undeniable. There was Tom's picture, his profile, and the messages he'd sent, flirting, suggesting they meet up. The betrayal cut deep, a wound I wasn't sure could ever heal. When Tom came home that night, I was waiting, the screenshots glowing accusingly on my tablet. His reaction was one of shock, then anger, not at being caught but at being confronted. What, you're spying on me now? Invading my privacy? He exploded, the audacity of his anger almost laughable. Spare me, Tom. How long? How long have you been doing this? I demanded, my voice shaking with emotion. Tom's anger fizzled out, replaced by a resignation that was somehow worse. I don't know, Jess. A while, I guess. I needed something else. Something more. More than me. More than us, I said, the reality settling in like a stone in my stomach. Yeah, I guess so, he admitted, and with those words, the last of my hope evaporated. I want a divorce, I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Tom looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I married. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold indifference. Fine, he said simply. If that's what you want. The divorce proceedings were quick, devoid of the messy entanglements that come with shared assets or children. I moved back to my grandmother's house, the only place that still felt like home, carrying with me the pain of betrayal, but also a sense of relief. 3 months post-divorce, and life had started to settle into a new kind of normal, or as normal as it could get without Tom and his mom, Linda, in the picture. That is until my world got rocked again, but this time by loss. My grandmother passed away, leaving behind a void no one could fill. Along with the heartache came a surprise. She left me her house and a hefty sum of $800,000. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more surreal, Linda showed up at my doorstep, bursting with a kind of frantic excitement that felt out of place given the recent funeral. Jess, darling. I heard about your inheritance. What a blessing. Linda gushed, not wasting a second on pleasantries. I stared at her, incredulous. Linda, what are you doing here? She brushed past me into the house, as if we were still family. Now that you've come into this money, you can surely afford to help me out a bit more. Not just the usual $1,000, but maybe double that? And, oh, a small gift wouldn't hurt. Something nice, expensive. Her words were like a slap in the face, each one more absurd than the last. But it was her next statement that really threw me. And since you're so well off now, I suppose it's okay for you to have a baby with Tom. I mean, with this kind of money, why not? I couldn't help it, laughter bubbled up from within me, loud and uncontrollable. Linda looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Linda, you do know Tom and I are divorced, right? 3 months ago. Your son and I are done. Over. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something that looked suspiciously like panic. Divorced? But Tom never said. Why would he hide that? Maybe because he didn't want to crawl back to Mommy's house? Or maybe he thought you'd cut him off financially? I shrugged, the absurdity of the situation not lost on me. Linda fumbled for her phone, dialing Tom in a frenzy. The conversation was short and heated, her voice rising with every word until she finally hung up, her face pale. He said it's true. Said he didn't tell me because he wanted to maintain independence. Independence. Now he tells me this, when we could have been rich. Linda, it's time for you to go, I said, my patience wearing thin. She stood, defeated, but then, with a last-ditch effort, she turned to me. Jess, can't you reconsider? For the sake of the family? Tom made a mistake, but surely. I cut her off with another round of laughter. Linda, there is no family, not between me and Tom. And after everything, you really think I'd go back to him? Please, leave. One morning, as I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, the sun casting gentle patterns on the table, there was a knock at the door. Hesitant, I approached, half expecting Linda or, worse, Tom, to be on the other side. Instead, I found an old friend from nursing school, Maya, her face bright with a smile that was both comforting and contagious. I heard about your grandma, Jess. I'm so sorry. And then I heard about, well, everything else, Maya said, stepping inside as I waved her in. We sat down, and over coffee, we caught up on life, on the turns mine had taken, and on her adventures since we last spoke. It was Maya who, after hearing my story, looked me dead in the eye and said, Jess, it's time. Time to move on, for real. You've got this chance, this freedom. What's stopping you from taking the leap? Her words struck a chord. I've been thinking, I started, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it's time to go back to school, like I always wanted. Get that degree, move into a field I'm passionate about. Yes. Maya clapped her hands, her excitement palpable. That's the spirit. Look, life's thrown you some curveballs, but you're still standing. And now you've got this incredible opportunity to do something just for you. The conversation with Maya lit a fire under me. It was the push I needed to finally make a decision, to move forward with purpose. I started researching programs that night, my heart set on advancing my career in a way I'd only ever dreamed of. But life has a funny way of testing you. Just as I was settling into this new chapter, Tom appeared on my doorstep one evening, looking every bit the man I once thought I knew. Jess, can we talk? He asked, a nervous edge to his voice I wasn't used to. I hesitated, a part of me curious, another part wary. All right, Tom. Talk. He shuffled uncomfortably, looking around as if searching for the right words in the air around him. I heard about your inheritance. And about what you're doing with it. Going back to school, that's great, Jess. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. Thanks, Tom. Was there something else? He sighed, a deep, weary sound. I guess I just wanted to see if there was a chance for us. I've been doing some thinking, Anne. No, Tom, I cut him off, my voice firm but not unkind. There's no chance for us. Not anymore. I've moved on, really moved on. And you should too. As he turned to leave, I felt a weight lift, a final closure on a chapter that had dragged on too long. In the days that followed, I found myself more focused, more determined. I was building a life on my own terms, free from the expectations and disappointments of the past. My studies gave me a sense of direction, and my grandmother's inheritance allowed me the freedom to pursue my dreams without restraint.
My name's Carol, just a regular high school teacher with a love for old books and a quiet life. My world changed when I met David at the school fair. He was the main sponsor, the kind of guy who makes things happen without making a fuss about it. He had that quiet confidence and a smile that could light up the gloomiest day. It started with a thank you note I sent him for his generous contribution. He replied with invitation for coffee, saying it was the least he could do for the hard work we teachers were putting in. I remember walking into that coffee shop, my heart racing a bit, thinking, Carol, it's just coffee, not a moon landing. David was easy to talk to. We chatted about everything, from books to the best pizza in town. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Before we knew it, coffee turned into dinner, and dinners turned into weekends together. A few months in, he wanted me to meet his mother, Mrs. Winters. She's a bit old school, but she'll love you, he said. I was a bundle of nerves, wanting to make a good impression. I picked out my nicest dress and spent more time on my hair than I'd like to admit. The moment we walked into Mrs. Winters' living room, I felt her eyes on me like a hawk. So, you're the teacher David won't stop talking about, she said, her voice colder than I expected. I smiled, reached out for a handshake, but she just nodded, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. Dinner was an experience. Mrs. Winters had this way of talking where every compliment sounded like she was doing you a favor. That's an interesting dress, dear. Vintage shop? She said, her eyebrow raised just so. I felt my cheeks burn, but I managed a small thank you. It's one of my favorites. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent hang in there, but the digs kept coming. A teacher, huh? Must be tough dealing with kids all day. Hope you don't bring that school discipline home. She chuckled, sipping her wine like it was the last one on earth. I really tried, to keep the conversation light, but it was like dancing on thin ice. David changed the topic, talked about his work, the weather, anything to steer away from the silent judgments being passed across the table. Fast forward a few months, and there I was, in a white dress, saying "I-do" to the man who made it all worth it. The wedding was a blur of laughter, tears, and dancing. Mrs. Winters was there, of course, dressed to the nines and handing out opinions like candy. Lovely ceremony, though I'd have gone for real flowers, not these. What are these, dear plastic? She said, eyeing the decorations. We moved into David's home soon after. It was a beautiful place, cozy and welcoming, except for the chill I felt whenever Mrs. Winters was around. David assured me it would get better, that she just needed time to get used to me. Moving into David's home felt like stepping into a new world, one where every corner held a memory of Mrs. Winters' reign. It wasn't long before I got introduced to her morning ritual, the infamous inspection. It started like clockwork every morning. The minute the clock struck 10, the front door would creak open, and in she'd walk like the queen of her castle. Mrs. Winters had this air about her, like she owned every inch of the place. Her first move was always to slip on those pristine white gloves, snapping them tight like she was about to perform surgery. "Morning, Carol dear," she'd say, her voice dripping with a sweetness that never reached her eyes. "Just here to help you keep the place up to David's standards." I'd force a smile, my hands clenching the dish towel a bit too tight. "Thanks, Mrs. Winters, but I've got it covered." She'd tut and shake her head, already walking towards the living room. "Nonsense, dear. You're new to this. It takes a keen eye to keep a house like this." And then it'd begin. She'd glide from room to room, that white handkerchief in her hand sweeping over every surface. It was like watching some twisted ballet, her movements precise, calculated. "You see here, dear," she'd say, holding up the handkerchief, now with a faint smudge of dust. "This is what I'm talking about. Can't have David living in a dustbin, can we?" I bit my tongue, the words "it's not a dustbin" sitting at the tip, but I swallowed them down. David had asked me to play nice, and I was trying, really trying. The worst was the kitchen. That's my territory, I love cooking, always have. But she'd march in there like a general, inspecting the troops. These pots aren't going to clean themselves, dear, she'd cluck, her fingers running over the rim of a saucepan I'd just washed. It's clean, Mrs. Winters, I'd insist, my voice steady despite the storm inside. She'd hum, a sound that said, I've heard better jokes. Well, we have different standards, I suppose. David's used to a certain way, you see. I'd nod, grinding my teeth so hard I was afraid I'd chip a tooth. It was the same every day. The living room, the bedrooms, even the bathrooms weren't spared. By the time she'd leave, I'd feel like a deflated balloon, all my energy sapped by her constant nitpicking. David would come home, all smiles and hugs, and I'd put on a brave face. How was your day, love? He'd ask, and I'd muster the brightest smile I could. Oh, you know the usual. Mrs. Winters stopped by to give some helpful tips, I'd say, the word helpful taking all my acting skills to sound even remotely sincere. He'd frown, that wrinkle appearing between his brows. I'll talk to her, Carol. She means, well, she just has her way, you know. I knew. Oh, how I knew. But what I didn't know was how long I could play this game, smiling through the inspections, biting back the words that screamed inside me. Saturday mornings should have been about lazy breakfasts and staying in pajamas till noon. But in our house, they were about one thing, the dreaded family dinner. It wasn't just any dinner. It was the weekly performance, with Mrs. Winters as the stern judge and me. Well, I was the hopeful contestant, always falling short. I'd be up at the crack of dawn, the kitchen my battlefield. Pots and pans clanged, the oven roared, and spices danced in the air. It was my attempt, week after week, to impress the unimpressible. Mrs. Winters. David, bless his heart, would stumble in half awake. Need any help, love? He'd ask, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I'd shoo him away with a spoon covered in sauce. Go get ready. Your mom will be here any minute, and you know how she is about punctuality. He'd chuckle, a sound that held a mix of love and a hint of worry. Yeah, if you're on time, you're late, that's her motto. The clock hadn't even struck 6 when we'd hear the sharp rap on the door. Showtime. Mrs. Winters and Mr. Winters would step in, him with his warm smile, her with her eyes already scanning for faults. Smells good in here, Carol. What's on the menu today? Mr. Winters would always start off with a compliment, his genuine kindness a stark contrast to his wife. Before I could answer, Mrs. Winters would chime in, her voice slicing through the warmth. I hope it's not that casserole from last time. Remember, David, how you had that stomach ache. David would wince, a silent plea in his eyes, begging me not to retort. Mom, Carol's been working hard all day. Let's just enjoy the meal, yeah? Dinner would be a tense affair. Mr. Winters would heap praises, his delicious dear, and you've outdone yourself, Carol, battling against Mrs. Winters's relentless critique. This chicken is dry, dear. You really must learn to keep an eye on the oven, she'd say, pushing her barely touched plate away. I'd grit my teeth, forcing a polite, I'll remember that for next time, Mrs. Winters. David would try to lighten the mood, his jokes a desperate attempt to bridge the widening gap at the table, but it was like throwing pebbles into a chasm, hoping for a bridge. And then, just when I thought I'd survived the worst, dessert would come, and with it, a fresh wave of critiques. Is this pie supposed to be this? Crunchy? Mrs. Winters would ask, the word crunchy sounding more like catastrophics. I'd swallow the lump in my throat, my reply a mix of wariness and defiance. It's a family recipe, Mrs. Winters. It's always a hit. She'd raise an eyebrow, her gaze saying clearer than words, Not in this family, dear. As they'd leave, Mr. Winters would give me a warm, encouraging hug, whispering, Don't mind her, Carol. We all love your cooking. But Mrs. Winters's parting words would always be a reminder of the invisible scoreboard where I was always trailing. Try harder next time, dear. A happy husband is a well-fed husband. The door would close behind them, and I'd stand there, a mix of frustration and defeat simmering inside. David would wrap his arms around me, his silence a mix of apology and solidarity. It's just one night a week, love. We'll get through this, he'd whisper, his words a lifebuoy in the stormy seas of Saturday dinners. The news of the pregnancy should have been a moment of pure joy, a new chapter for David and me. But amidst the excitement, a shadow lingered, the thought of Mrs. Winters' reaction. David was over the moon, grinning ear to ear. "We're going to be parents. Carol, can you believe it?" he'd say, wrapping me in a hug so tight it felt like nothing could go wrong. But the first time Mrs. Winters dropped by after hearing the news, the air was thick with tension. I braced myself for her words, hoping maybe, just maybe, this new life might soften her. "Well, I do hope you've read up on parenting, Carol. It's not all cooing and cuddling, you know," she started, her tone as sharp as ever. I bit back a sigh, a fake smile plastered on. "We're thrilled, Mrs. Winters. And yes, we're reading a lot, getting ready for the baby." She sniffed, peering at me like she was assessing if I was up to the task. Well, make sure you follow the right books. Some of these modern ideas are just nonsense." David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent message of support. But as the weeks turned into months, the pressure didn't ease. Mrs. Winters' visits became a litany of advice and thinly veiled criticism. "You're not eating enough greens, Carol. You want the baby to be healthy, don't you?" she'd say, eyeing my plate like it was a crime scene. "Or make sure you're not being too lazy. Exercise is important, but don't overdo it. You wouldn't want to harm the baby." It was a no-win situation. Do too little and I was careless. Do too much and I was reckless. The breaking point came one quiet afternoon. Mrs. Winters had just left. Her parting words, "Make sure the nursery is painted soon. You don't want the baby coming home to an unready house," ringing in my ears. David found me in the nursery, the paint samples scattered around, tears streaming down my face. "Carol, what's wrong? Talk to me, love," he said, his voice laced with worry. I let it all out, the frustration, the hurt, the exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore, David. It's like I'm walking on eggshells in my own home, your mother. It's just too much." David's face hardened, a rare sight. "I'll talk to her, Carol. This ends now. You and the baby are my priority." And he did. That evening, I heard hushed, tense voices from the living room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. David was setting boundaries, fighting for our little family. The next day, Mrs. Winters' visits stopped. No more morning inspections, no more veiled insults. It was a relief, yet the silence felt heavy, charged with unsaid words and unresolved tensions. David was quieter, too, his smiles not reaching his eyes. "She's my mom, Carol. It hurts, but you and the baby come first." "Always?" I held him close, the future uncertain but our resolve clear. We were a team, and we'd face whatever came next, together. 7 years flew by since Lily, our little bundle of joy, came into our world. David was a doting father, his love for Lily shining in his every action. My father-in-law, a gentle soul, adored his granddaughter, his face lighting up with every giggle and every new word Lily spoke. But there was a chill that never thawed, a coldness that lingered in the air whenever Mrs. Winters was around. She kept her distance from Lily, her words as sharp as ever. "Children should be seen and not heard," she'd say, dismissing Lily's cheerful chatter as nothing more than noise. Lily, with her big heart and innocent eyes, couldn't understand why her grandma wasn't like the ones in her storybooks. She'd try, in her own sweet way, to win over Mrs. Winters. "Look, Grandma, I drew this for you," she'd say, holding up a crayon masterpiece. Mrs. Winters would barely glance at it, her voice devoid of warmth. "That's nice, dear. Now go play. Grandma's busy." But Lily never lost her spirit. She found her passion early, cooking. The kitchen was her kingdom, her small hands skillfully mixing, stirring, and baking. Every weekend was a new adventure, her culinary creations a source of pride for us. "Look, Daddy, I made cookies," she'd exclaim, her face beaming as she presented her latest work. David would scoop her up, his laughter filling the room. "Chef Lily, you have outdone yourself! These are delicious!" Even my father-in-law couldn't resist Lily's kitchen magic. "My little chef," he'd say, his eyes twinkling as he took a bite, "you'll be running your own restaurant in no time." Their words were a balm to Lily's soul, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she received from Mrs. Winters. But children have a resilience, a way of focusing on the love they receive, not the affection withheld. One evening, as Lily set the table, her latest culinary creation taking center stage, she looked up at me, her eyes serious. "Mom, why doesn't Grandma like my cooking? Doesn't she like food?" I knelt beside her, my heart aching with the innocence of her question. "Sweetheart, Grandma, she's just different. But your cooking is wonderful, and Daddy and Grandpa and I, we love it. That's what matters, right?" Lily nodded, her smile returning, the shadow of Mrs. Winters's indifference brushed aside by the love of those who mattered most. The Christmas invite from Mrs. Winters was a surprise, but Lily's excitement at the chance to showcase her cooking made us accept. Together, we baked gingerbread and apple pie, her little hands working diligently, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Grandma and everyone are gonna love these, right, Mom?" she'd ask, her confidence as warm as the oven. "Absolutely, sweetheart," I'd reassure her, though a part of me dreaded the unpredictable tides of Mrs. Winters's approval. Arriving at the bustling house, we placed our dishes on the grand Christmas table, an array of colors and smells that promised a feast. Lily's face was a picture of joy and anticipation as we mingled, catching up with relatives we hadn't seen in ages. But as we settled at the table, ready to share the meal and the joy of the season, Lily's excitement turned to confusion, then distress. "Mom, where's our gingerbread and pie?" she whispered, her small voice trembling. I scanned the table, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Our dishes were missing. Mrs. Winters at the head of the table was holding court, her laughter ringing out clear and sharp. I approached her, my voice firm but polite. "Mrs. Winters, the dishes Lily and I brought, where are they?" Her laughter cut through the festive hum, cold and piercing. "Oh, those." "I tossed them out, dear. We can't risk serving just anything to our guests, can we?" The room fell silent, the air heavy with shock and disbelief. Lily's eyes filled with tears, her dream of sharing her love through her cooking dashed in an instant. "But I made them for everyone. I worked so hard," she managed to say, her voice a fragile whisper against the weight of her grandmother's harsh words. Mrs. Winters shrugged, her eyes void of any warmth. "Well, dear, not everything made with love is fit for the table. Better safe than sorry." That was the last straw. David, who had always been the bridge between his mother and our family, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loudly. "Mom, that's cruel. How could you?" he said, his voice steady, but loaded with an anger I had rarely seen in him. Lily poured her heart into those dishes. She wanted to share something special, and you just threw it away like it was nothing. Mrs. Winters's smile faltered, her eyes widening in surprise. This was not the mild-mannered son she was used to. "David, I was just—" "No, Mom, you went too far. Disrespecting Carol is one thing, but hurting Lily, your own granddaughter, that's something I can't and won't forgive," he interrupted, his disappointment and anger clear and unwavering. The room was still, the festive air replaced by a tense silence. Mrs. Winters sat there, the impact of David's words hitting her. She had expected compliance, maybe a few whispered complaints, but not this. Not her usually gentle son standing up to her, defending his family with such resolve. The air was thick with tension as we left Mrs. Winters's house, the festive lights mocking us with their cheer. The sound of Lily's quiet sobs was louder than the Christmas carols that played in the background. David's hand was firm on my shoulder, a silent pillar of strength. As we reached the door, Mrs. Winters's voice broke through the heavy silence, her tone desperate, a stark contrast to the cold disdain she'd shown earlier. "Please don't go. I'm sorry," she stammered, her eyes wet with tears that seemed out of place on her stern face. David stopped, turning back to face his mother. The room held its breath. "Sorry. Now you're sorry." His voice was low, but it cut through the room, sharp and clear. "You humiliated your own granddaughter, Mom. You broke her heart. There's no sorry that can fix that." Mrs. Winters's sobs grew louder, her composure shattered, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the cracks too deep to mend. In the tense silence that followed, Mr. Winters stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "I can't sit here and pretend this is okay, Martha." "Not this time." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the burden of a decision long overdue. The room felt colder, the festive warmth snuffed out by a single act of unkindness. One by one, the guests stood up, their faces somber, their goodbyes muted and brief. The festive gathering was unraveling, the threads of family and friendship coming undone. As the last guest left, the door closing with a soft click, the magnitude of what had happened settled in the room. Mrs. Winters sat alone at the table, her sobs the only sound in the house that moments ago was filled with laughter and chatter. Outside, the cold air bit at our cheeks, a stark reminder of the warmth we'd left behind. David's arm was around Lily, her small body leaning into his for comfort. We walked in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us. Back home, as we sat in the living room, the Christmas tree lights twinkling softly, a sense of peace settled over us. It was a fragile peace, one born from the chaos of the night, but it was ours. Lily, nestled between us, her tears dried, but the hurt still fresh in her eyes, looked up and whispered, "Are we okay, Mom, Dad?" David hugged her closer, a silent vow in his embrace. "We're more than okay, sweetheart. We're together, and that's all that matters." And in that moment, as we held each other, the trials of the night receded, leaving behind a simple truth. Family wasn't just about shared blood or shared names. It was about shared love, shared pain, and the shared resolve to stand together when the world seemed to crumble around us. The fallout from that chaotic Christmas dinner rippled through our family like a shockwave. The house felt different, quieter, the air still tinged with the remnants of that night's revelations. David was somber, his usual cheer dimmed by the events that had unfolded. "I'm sorry, Carol," he said one evening as we sat in the living room, the only sound the ticking of the clock. "I should have stood up for you and Lily sooner. I let it go on for too long." I reached for his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against mine. "You did what you thought was best, David. We both did. But now we know better. We move forward together." He nodded, the lines on his face softening. But the true shock came the next day when Mr. Winters showed up at our doorstep, his eyes weary, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David opened the door wider, concern etched on his face. "Of course, Dad. Is everything okay?" Mr. Winters took a seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas," he started, his voice trailing off. We waited, the tension thick in the air. Finally he looked up, his eyes meeting ours. "I can't believe Martha could be so cruel, so heartless to her own granddaughter. I never imagined she could go that far." David shifted in his seat, the weight of his father's words heavy on his shoulders. "Dad, Mr. Winters raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, David, I should have seen it, should have done something sooner. But I didn't, and now I'm thinking about a divorce." The word hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Divorce wasn't a word thrown around lightly in our family, and coming from Mr. Winters, it was a bombshell. "Divorce!" David echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. Mr. Winters nodded, a resolute look on his face. "I can't be with someone who shows such. Such cruelty not just to Carol and Lily, but to her own family. I've turned a blind eye for too long, hoping things would change. But after what happened at Christmas, I can't ignore it anymore. We sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The decision was monumental, not just for Mr. Winters, but for all of us. It was a line in the sand, a declaration that enough was enough. "Whatever you decide, Dad, we're here for you," David said, his voice firm. "You've always been there for us, and that won't change." Mr. Winters smiled, a weary, sad smile. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." In the days that followed, our family found a new rhythm, a new way of being. The shadows of the past lingered, but so did the promise of a fresh start, a chance to build something stronger and more resilient from the broken pieces. Lily's laughter returned, filling the house with a warmth that pushed back the darkness. And as we sat together, the three of us with Mr. Winters now a more frequent visitor, I realized that family wasn't about tolerating the intolerable. It was about standing up for each other, about choosing love and respect over blood and tradition. In the quiet moments, when the night wrapped the world in its embrace, I'd look at my little family and know that, despite the storms we'd weathered, we were stronger together. And no amount of cruelty or coldness could ever change that.
My name is Julia, and I never imagined my life would turn out like this. I grew up in a pretty normal family, well, normal for us anyway. My dad was always busy with his window frame business, and my mom took care of the house. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Dad rarely talked about work at home. He'd come in late, give Mom a quick kiss, and ask me how school was. That was about it. I didn't mind though. I was happy in my own little world. I remember the day everything changed. I was 22, fresh out of college and trying to figure out what to do with my life. I overheard Dad on the phone, his voice tense. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you take over my company. I've worked too hard for this," he said. I shouldn't have eavesdropped, but I couldn't help it. My stomach twisted as I listened. Dad's company was in trouble? Why hadn't he said anything? That night at dinner, I watched him closely. He seemed normal, joking with Mom about her overcooked pot roast. But I saw the worry lines around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. I had to do something. But what? I didn't know the first thing about business. Still, I couldn't just sit back and watch my family's livelihood get destroyed. The next day, I did some digging. It wasn't hard to find out who was trying to take over Dad's company. Big shot businessman named Robert Caldwell. His office wasn't far from our house. The receptionist looked at me like I was crazy when I asked to see Mr. Caldwell. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, eyebrow raised. "No, but it's important. Please, just 5 minutes," I begged. She must have taken pity on me, because after a phone call, she waved me towards the elevator. "Top floor," she said. The ride up felt like it took forever. When the doors opened, I was face to face with Robert Caldwell himself. He was older than I expected, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. Well, he said, looking me up and down. "What do we have here?" I swallowed hard. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Julia Thompson. I'm here about my father's company, Thompson Windows." His eyebrows shot up. "Thompson's daughter? This is unexpected. Come in, let's talk." I followed him into his office, trying not to gape at the view. He settled behind his massive desk and gestured for me to sit. "So, Miss Thompson, what can I do for you?" I took a deep breath. "Please don't take over my father's company. It means everything to him. There must be another way." Caldwell leaned back, studying me. "Interesting. I have a proposition for you, Miss Thompson. I'll leave your father's company alone if you agree to marry my son. I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. Excuse me? You heard me. Marry my son, make him grow up a little. Do that, and your father's company is safe. I left Caldwell's office in a daze. Marry his son? Was he insane? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't have much choice. It was either this or watch my father's life's work crumble. The next day, I found myself back in that intimidating office. Caldwell was waiting, a smug smile on his face. So, Miss Thompson, have you made your decision? I took a deep breath. Yes, I'll do it. I'll marry your son. Caldwell clapped his hands together. Excellent. Let's introduce you two, shall we? Before I knew it, I was being ushered into another room. And there he was, Caldwell's son. I'd expected some stuffy businessman type, but the man who stood up to greet me was anything but. He was tall, with messy dark hair and a crooked smile. Hey, he said, extending his hand. I'm Jack. You must be Julia? I shook his hand, trying not to show my surprise. Yeah, that's me. Jack's father cleared his throat. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. As soon as the door closed behind him, Jack's casual demeanor vanished. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. Look, I'm sorry about this. My dad, he's got some pretty old-fashioned ideas. I shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant. It's fine. We're both adults, right? We can handle this. Jack laughed, but it sounded forced. Yeah, sure. Just a casual arranged marriage. No big deal. We spent the next hour talking, and I hate to admit it, but Jack was kind of interesting. He was smart and funny, even if he did seem a bit irresponsible. I could see why his father wanted him to grow up. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I started dating, if you could call it that. We went out to dinners, movies, the usual stuff. But there was always this undercurrent of awkwardness. We both knew this wasn't real, no matter how much we pretended. And so, 6 months after that fateful meeting in Caldwell's office, I found myself walking down the aisle. My dad looked so proud, so happy. He had no idea of the deal I'd made to save his company. As I said my vows, I looked into Jack's eyes. There was no love there, not really. But there was friendship, and maybe that could be enough. The reception was a blur of congratulations and champagne. Jack's mother, Elizabeth, cornered me at one point, her smile tight. Welcome to the family, dear, she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. I do hope you'll make Jack happy. I plastered on my best fake smile. I'll certainly try, Mrs. Caldwell. As we left for our honeymoon, I caught a glimpse of my father-in-law. He was beaming, clearly pleased with himself. I felt a flash of anger. This was all just a game to him. The first few years of our marriage were interesting, to say the least. Jack and I settled into a routine of sorts. We lived in a nice house, courtesy of his father's wealth, but it felt more like we were roommates than husband and wife. I tried my best to be a good influence on Jack. Slowly but surely, I saw changes in him. He started spending less time with his party-loving friends and more time at the office with his father. I could see the pride in his father's eyes when Jack started showing real interest in the business. It made me feel like maybe this whole arrangement wasn't for nothing. Jack's mother, on the other hand, was a different story. She never outright said anything, but I could feel her disapproval radiating off her in waves. The way she'd purse her lips when I spoke, or the backhanded compliments she'd give. Oh, Julia, that dress is interesting. So brave of you to wear something like that. I'd grit my teeth and smile. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. Despite the challenges, I held on to hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jack and I could grow to love each other. Maybe when we had kids, things would change. But life had other plans. It was a crisp fall day when we got the news. Jack and I sat in the doctor's office, the silence heavy between us. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "But the tests show that you, Mr. Caldwell, are unable to father children." The words hit me like a physical blow. No children. The one thing I'd been counting on to bring us closer, to make this marriage real, was now impossible. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about my own parents. Dad's business had flourished since my marriage to Jack. He'd even managed to double his turnover. I was happy for him, truly. But I couldn't help feeling a bit lost. I wanted to work, to have a purpose beyond being Jack's wife. But when I brought it up to him, his response was swift and firm. "Work? Why would you need to work? We have more than enough money." "It's not about the money, Jack. I want to do something meaningful." He shook his head. "In our circle, wives don't work. They do charity. Why don't you start a foundation or something?" And so, the Julia Caldwell Foundation for Children with Cancer was born. It wasn't what I'd imagined for myself, but it gave me purpose. I threw myself into the work, organizing fundraisers, visiting hospitals, doing whatever I could to help. Jack didn't seem to care much about my new passion. In fact, he didn't seem to care much about anything I did these days. We were living parallel lives, inhabiting the same space, but rarely intersecting. Years passed. 10, to be exact. And then, everything changed again. Jack's father died suddenly of a heart attack. Just like that, Jack was thrust into the role of CEO. I tried to be supportive, but I could see him struggling under the weight of his new responsibilities. 2 years after that, we got more bad news. Jack's mother had cancer. "We should move her to a care facility," Jack said, his voice detached. "They can take better care of her there." But his mother refused. "I will die in my own home," she declared, her chin lifted defiantly. And so, drawing on my years of experience with the Cancer Foundation, I took charge of her care. I hired nurses, coordinated treatments, and spent hours by her bedside. To my surprise, Elizabeth's attitude towards me began to soften. One day, as I was adjusting her pillows, she caught my hand. "You're a good woman, Julia," she said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." 5 years passed since Jack took over his father's company. I wish I could say things improved, but the truth was far from it. Jack's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was drinking more, coming home at odd hours, and snapping at me for the smallest things. One day, I received a call from Jack's assistant. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Caldwell hasn't been to the office in days. Is everything all right?" When he finally stumbled home that night, reeking of alcohol, I confronted him. "Jack, what's happening?" "Your assistant called." "You haven't been to work?" He laughed bitterly. "Work? What's the point? The company's going under anyway." Dear old Dad left me a sinking ship, and I couldn't keep it afloat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those years of hard work, gone? And Jack seemed almost relieved. Desperate to salvage something, I reached out to my father. Despite being semi-retired, he agreed to help. He offered Jack a position as his deputy, hoping to mentor him back to success. But Jack's heart wasn't in it. He showed up late, left early, and generally did the bare minimum. I watched helplessly as my father's sales figures began to drop. I knew I had to have a serious talk with Jack. One night, after he'd had a few drinks, as usual, I approached him. "Jack, we need to talk about work. You're barely showing up. My father's company is suffering because of you." Jack's face contorted with anger. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I never wanted this, Jules. Any of it. What are you talking about?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This life. This marriage. I'm just waiting for Mom to kick the bucket so I can sell her house and get out of here." I stared at him, horrified. "How can you say that? Your mother is dying, and all you care about is her money? Don't act all high and mighty," he spat. "We both know this marriage is a sham. You're just as eager to get out as I am." Disgusted, I turned to leave the room. As I opened the door, I came face to face with Jack's mother. The look on her face told me she'd heard everything. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, silently, she reached out and squeezed my hand. In that gesture, I felt her gratitude, her understanding, and her sorrow. The day I got the call about my parents' plane crash, my world shattered. Mom and Dad, gone in an instant. Their small plane to Hawaii, meant to be a second honeymoon, became their final journey. I needed support, someone to lean on. But Jack? He was nowhere to be found. My own husband couldn't even be bothered to show up to the funeral. As I stood there, watching my parents' caskets lowered into the ground, I felt more alone than ever. After the funeral, anger began to replace my sorrow. How dare he? How could he abandon me when I needed him most? With this newfound fury fueling me, I marched into Dad's company, our company now, I supposed. The sight that greeted me when I entered Dad's old office made my blood boil. There was Jack, lounging in Dad's chair like he owned the place, barking orders like some conquering hero. "Jack," I said, my voice tight with barely contained rage. "We need to talk." He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance. "What is it now, Jules? Can't you see I'm busy?" "Busy?" I spat. "You couldn't even be busy enough to come to my parents' funeral." Jack rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go with the moralizing again. You know what, Jules? Always nagging, always pushing. Well, I'm done with it. And I'm done with you." I stared at him, shocked. Then I saw something change in his eyes. A cold, calculating look replaced the anger. "You know, Jules," he said, his voice suddenly calm, "this company? It's worth about $17 million. And guess what? As deputy director, it's all mine now." My heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" He leaned back in the chair, Dad's chair, with a smug smile. "I'm the deputy director. I have all the passwords, access to all the accounts. I'm in charge now, and there's nothing you can do about it." "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "You've already run your father's company into the ground. I won't let you do the same to my father's legacy." Jack laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "Oh, I'm not going to run it. I'm going to sell it, piece by piece. And then I'm going to live like a king." Before I could stop him, he turned to the computer. I watched in horror as he transferred a large sum from the company account to his personal one. "There," he said, turning back to me. "That should keep me comfortable for a while." Then, as if this whole thing was just a minor inconvenience, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. He tossed them at me casually. "Oh, and here, divorce papers. I think it's time we ended this farce, don't you?" I caught the papers reflexively, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It was too much, too fast. My parents dead, my marriage over, my father's company being stolen right in front of me. I left the office in a daze, divorce papers clutched in my hand. But as I walked, something inside me shifted. I'd spent years bending to Jack's will, to his father's manipulations. No more. It was time to fight back. With renewed determination, I headed straight to my father's lawyer's office. Mr. Henderson had been Dad's friend and confidant for years. If anyone could help me, it would be him. "Julia," Mr. Henderson said, rising to greet me as I entered his office. "I'm so sorry about your parents. How are you holding up?" I collapsed into the chair across from him, the events of the day spilling out in a rush. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Julia, I think it's time I shared something with you. Your father's will. He made some changes just before the accident." As he read the will, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The company, it was mine. All mine. Dad had left it to me, not Jack. But there was more. Mr. Henderson looked up from the papers, his eyes twinkling. "There's something else you should know. Your father dismissed Jack 2 weeks before his death. Fired him outright." I couldn't help it, I laughed. A real, genuine laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. So all those orders Jack was giving. Completely meaningless, Mr. Henderson confirmed. Then he pulled out an envelope. "There's one more thing. A letter from your father." With shaking hands, I opened it. Dad's familiar handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes. "My dearest Julia," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry for leaving you like this, but I hope I've left you with the tools to build the life you deserve. The company is yours now. And Jules? It's time to let go of Jack. You've given enough of yourself to that marriage. It's time to live for you. I love you, sweetheart. Make me proud." I looked up at Mr. Henderson, wiping my eyes. "Do you have a pen?" Without a word, he handed me one. I signed the divorce papers Jack had given me, feeling lighter with each stroke of the pen. "Can you file these?" I asked, handing them back. "I want this done as quickly as possible." Mr. Henderson nodded. "Consider it done." As I left his office, I felt free. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, I was in control of my own life. No more Jack, no more Caldwell's pulling my strings. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, my best friend from the Charity Foundation. "Sarah? It's Julia. Want to meet for coffee? I've got some news." An hour later, we were seated in our favorite cafe, lattes in hand. "So," Sarah said, eyeing me curiously. "What's this big news?" I took a deep breath, then let it all out. Jack, the company, the divorce. Sarah listened, her eyes widening. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Girl, you're free. And now you're the boss." I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "I don't know, Sarah. Can I really run a company?" She fixed me with a stern look. "Are you kidding me? Julia, you've been running that charity foundation like a pro for years. You're smart, you're organized, and you actually care about people. You're going to be an amazing CEO." After my talk with Sarah, I felt invigorated. It was time to face the music and get my things from Jack's house. I never really thought of it as my home, and now I knew why. I found my mother-in-law, Elizabeth, in the living room. Her face was drawn, tired from her ongoing battle with cancer. "Elizabeth," I said gently, "I'm here to get my things. Jack and I, we're getting divorced." To my surprise, her eyes filled with tears. Julia, I know I haven't always been kind to you. But you've been so good to me. Would you consider taking me with you? I was stunned. You want to come with me? Before she could answer, the front door slammed open. Jack stormed in, his face red with fury. You, he shouted, pointing at me. What the hell did you do? The company accounts are blocked. I can't access the money. I straightened my spine, looking him dead in the eye. That money isn't yours, Jack. It never was. Oh, and by the way, my father fired you 2 weeks ago. You have no claim to the company. I've already instructed security not to let you in the building. Jack's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then his gaze shifted, noticing his mother packing a suitcase. Mom, what are you doing? Elizabeth looked at her son, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. I'm going with Julia. I'm sorry, Jack, but you've proven to be unreliable. Jack's face turned an even deeper shade of red. Unreliable? Me? This is all your fault. You raised me to be this way. You and your coddling and your expectations. He turned to me, his voice dripping with venom. Fine. Get out. Both of you. I don't need either of you. I felt a wave of pity for him. This angry, bitter man was a far cry from the charming, if irresponsible, guy I'd married. But I couldn't let that sway me. Not anymore. Come on, Elizabeth, I said softly. Let's get your things. As we packed, Jack continued to rant and rave, hurling insults and blame. But we tuned him out, focusing on the task at hand. The drive to my parents' house was quiet. Elizabeth dozed in the passenger seat, the stress of the day taking its toll. As we pulled up to the house, a lump formed in my throat. It felt strange coming here without Mom and Dad. We're here, I said softly, gently waking Elizabeth. I helped her inside, leading her to my parents' room. It felt right, somehow, to give her this space. Are you sure? Elizabeth asked, her eyes wide as she took in the room. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. Yes. I think they would have wanted it this way. As I helped Elizabeth settle in, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for my parents, relief at being free from Jack, uncertainty about the future. But underneath it all, there was a glimmer of hope. Taking over Dad's company was like diving into the deep end of a pool without knowing how to swim. Those first few months were a whirlwind of meetings, financial reports, and sleepless nights. But I was determined to make it work. I hired Tom, a brilliant business consultant, as my right-hand man. He patiently guided me through the intricacies of running a multi-million-dollar company. You've got good instincts, Julia, he'd say. Trust them. Slowly but surely, I found my footing. 6 months in, I wasn't just treading water, I was swimming laps. The company's performance began to improve, and I felt a surge of pride knowing Dad would have been pleased. Through it all, I never neglected the Cancer Foundation. If anything, my work there became even more important to me. It was a link to my past and a beacon for my future. Elizabeth's condition worsened over time. I threw myself into her care, determined to make her final days as comfortable as possible. We grew close during those 2 years, healing old wounds and forming a bond one never thought possible. The day she passed, I held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Elizabeth." She squeezed my hand weakly, a small smile on her face, before slipping away peacefully. I organized the funeral myself, making sure everything was perfect. Jack didn't show up. I wasn't surprised, but it still stunned to see how far he'd fallen. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Mr. Henderson. "Julia, there's something you need to see." Can you come to my office? When I arrived, I was shocked to see Jack there, a young blonde hanging off his arm. He smirked at me. Well, if it isn't the little CEO. Don't worry, I'm just here to collect my inheritance. Mom and I might have had our differences, but blood is thicker than water, right? I bit my tongue, waiting for Mr. Henderson to speak. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading Elizabeth's will. As he spoke, I watched Jack's smug expression morph into disbelief, then fury. And so, I leave my house and all my savings to Julia Thompson, with the stipulation that the money be donated to the cancer foundation she so passionately supports. Tears sprang to my eyes. Elizabeth's final act of kindness overwhelmed me. Jack exploded. This is bullshit. She manipulated Mom. She's a fraud, a gold digger. She ruined my life, and now she's stealing my inheritance. His girlfriend, looking bewildered, stepped away from him. You said we'd be set for life with this money. I'm out of here. She stormed out, leaving Jack sputtering. As I left the office, I heard Jack's continued ranting fade behind me. I felt light, free. Elizabeth's gift wasn't just about the money, it was validation. She had seen me, truly seen me, and found me worthy,